Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Monk Chat, our weekly opportunity to ask questions and possibly receive answers. So Monk Chat is your opportunity to ask any questions you want to ask about anything whatsoever. And as long as it's related to Buddhism, then there's a relatively good chance that one or more of us will answer. So there is no specific set topic for Monk Chat. As long as it's related to Buddhism, it's considered on topic. So, for example, during the live streams earlier this week, some people asked off-topic questions, and we said to save those questions for Monk Chat. So if you remember those questions, this is your chance to bring them up again. And a couple people I see checking in so far. So hello to Kumu, Sud, and Facebook user.
Well, I think the Facebook groups makes it hidden.
And Janaki, hello to Janaki. Gita, hello Gita. And there was one question. It's technically not related to Buddhism. So I think I might...
Well, it kind of is actually. It is related to supporting Buddhism. So Sud asks, how much is your mortgage, dear Venables, for 1 month? Well, it's not technically our mortgage. It's the mortgage of the monastery where we are living. And I believe it's about $4,000 a month, something like that.
Something like that. For more details, you can contact the treasurer.
Yes.
And she can give you all the information that you want to know. Yeah, it's somewhere around there. I forget the exact number.
Oh, and the mysterious Facebook user is Canute.
Ah,
Good
Canute.
to see you, Canute.
Good to see you, Canute. Also, I see a few other friends. Daus, Rick, Jayanta, Yankee, Jason, Yudi, and Vivian. Good to see all of you. So Vivian has a question, which for some reason is targeted specifically at me. This says, could you please explain the difference between khandas number 3 and number 5? So the third khanda is Sannya, and the fifth one is Vijnana. So Sannya is the process of identification or recognition. It's commonly translated as perception, but I'm not a huge fan of that particular translation. Sannya it's from the verb root nya, which means to know, and the prefix sang, which means together. So in this case, the prefix doesn't actually give us that much information. So the root is about knowing. And Sannya is about knowing what it is that you're experiencing, what your sensations are, what they mean. So for example, when you bite an apple, then you experience taste and your mind identifies it as the taste of an apple. So Sannya is that part of your mind which recognizes, oh, this is an apple. That's what I'm experiencing. So the initial contact with your body is the first khanda. The experience of pleasure, assuming you like apples, is Vedana. And identifying it as an apple is Sannya. The fifth khanda is Vijnana, which we usually translate as consciousness. And I think that's a decent enough translation. Vijnana, by the way, is from the same root nya, which means knowing, and the prefix vi, which means separation or distinction. So Vijnana is knowing the separation between things, or can also simply mean a distinct and clear knowing. So again, here in this case, the etymology of the word is actually not that helpful. In the suttas, Vijnana is usually defined as meaning the awareness of a sensory domain. For example, Chakku Vijnana is a visual awareness. Sota Vijnana is auditory awareness, and so on. So awareness of seeing and being able to identify the objects you are seeing are two distinctly different things. So this is the difference between Sannya and Vijnana. Okay.
So just quickly, Canute asked the question essentially about the 5 aggregates. It might be worth just continuing on with your, your discussion.
Yeah, good point. So Knut says, again, wanting to know more about the 5 khandhas. So the one that I didn't mention is number 4, which is sankhara. Sankhara has a few different meanings depending on context. In the context of the 5 khandhas, it means mental activities or mental patterns, which are distinct from the more subtle mental activities of Vedana and Sannya, so feeling and identification. Sankhara is the coarser mental activities of thinking, visualizing, of more coarse mental activities and patterns. And as for how they relate to the 4 Noble Truths, well, briefly speaking, the Buddha says, Panchupadana Khandha Dukkha. So the 5 khandhas, when affected by clinging, are dukkha. And that's part of the first Noble Truth. So the problem here is the clinging. So the second Noble Truth is that it's the clinging to the 5 khandhas that makes it dukkha. So then naturally, if we relinquish that clinging, then the dukkha ends. And we experience the cessation of dukkha, which is the third Noble Truth. And the way we do that is through developing the Noble Eightfold Path, practicing the Noble Eightfold Path. So that's the 4th Noble Truth. So that's how the 5 khandhas relate to the 4 Noble Truths. Anything either of you want to add to that?
No.
Okay. And Anagarika Sarana says, what are the benefits of learning Pali? How long did it take you to be able to translate text to your mother language?
Right. Well, there are many benefits of learning Pali. Personally, what I really like, the reason why I started learning Pali was to better understand the suttas and also better understand also the translations actually that we have available. So sometimes, when we take the translations, we have a kind of like a preconceived idea ourselves of what it's translating or what those words sort of mean. But it's actually a very difficult job, the job of the translator, and to actually really capture the meaning, the right, kind of nuance or connotation of a word in translation. So we can kind of skip the intermediary and kind of approach the Pali language and the text and and have that opportunity of questioning also our understanding of the Dhamma that we receive perhaps in the translated form by doing the process ourselves of like, how can, for example, what is the right word for dukkha? How can we translate dukkha, whether it's suffering or dissatisfaction, etc.? What is the best way to how does it speak truthfully to our understanding, like of our reality of dukkha, and how is it more skillful to share it with people, for example, that speak our same language? So definitely that would be one of my favorite benefits. And then how long it takes. Well, it really depends on our particular sort of conditions right now. So for me, actually, it was taking me a long time to study the grammar when I was when I had first attempted to do it. And that's because I was a little bit lazy about it. So, at a certain point, I actually stopped. I closed the grammar book. And thanks to the digital Pali reader, actually, I started immediately translating just for fun one day. And I realized that I could actually translate. And that was because I had studied in high school in Italy. I have studied Latin and ancient Greek. So for anyone who has studied Latin and ancient Greek, basically we already have done most of the work that the Pali grammar basically asks us to do, which is understand how the language works. So if you have that kind of condition to begin with, then it takes very little time to understand Pali, because it's basically essentially just getting familiar with the new words and slightly with the new kind of forms like the suffix, the prefixes, etc. But the actual functioning of the language you understand already. So yeah, actually, I wished I had just started with translating and skipped the whole like trying to do the grammar thing to learn the grammar at the very beginning, because it took me very little time. But I'm still learning Pali. Obviously, that's that was the first kind of attempt, and then in order to perfect a language, then it takes quite some time. I haven't perfected even Italian, which is my mother tongue, nor English, as you can tell from my broken English. So it takes a while.
Yeah, so for me, it took about 1 year to learn how to read Pali. So after 1 year, I was able to read the suttas in Pali. And that was 1 year of studying every day. So I made a commitment that I would study for at least 15 minutes a day, every day. And at the end of 1 year, I could read the suttas in Pali. And at the end of 2 years or so, then I was able to translate. Yeah, the important thing is the commitment to working with the language every single day, studying the language every single day. And then eventually it will start to click together. How's your Pali these days?
I actually have time to do it these days. Well, usually, so it's better. But I would say that I'm quite a number of years away from being a master at it, for sure.
Yeah, so there's many different factors which go into how long it takes to learn a language, but the most important thing is persistence. The only guarantee is that if you don't try, then you will fail. That's the guarantee. But if you keep persistently studying every day, then at some point you'll realize that you're reading a Pali sentence and you understand exactly what it means. And you'll understand how to express that in another language as well. And next, Rick says, following deep meditation, I frequently experience an afterglow. However, sometimes my mind becomes more unsettled and emotional. Can you share some reflections on this?
Yeah, that's meditation. The number one, my reflection is the number one important thing to do is to never have any expectations about your meditation. Whatever happens before, during, and after is just what happens. Right? The best thing to do is to reflect on it, to kind of examine the causes and conditions. Right? You might be able to understand the causes and conditions of the difference between a meditation having an afterglow and the difference between the meditation being unsettled and emotional. And you could also observe how the attachment to wanting the afterglow instead of the unsettled and emotionalness after your meditation is causing you suffering. This is, no matter what your meditation is, it's your meditation. And don't get attached to it. Don't have any expectations. Just continue to observe it, investigate it, and learn from it. And try to see the causes and conditions. Try to chase back, like a detective trying to find clues. Try to trace back. Oh, okay, this happened in the middle, and then that this arose in my mind, and this led to this. And then then if it is like a hindrance that arises, that's important. Buddha wants us to know exactly how the hindrances arise and they cease. And then this way, when we become masters of them, we know how to starve them. We know how to cause them to cease. And then we can get into deeper states of concentration in our meditation.
Okay. And Kumo says, only ill will is included in the 10 unwholesome deeds. Is it because anger is the root for ill will? What about resentment? Is that the worst of the 3 states? So technically speaking, all of the 10 unwholesome actions are arising from greed, hatred, and delusion. So ill will is very clearly arising from aversion, from hatred. But actually all of the others arise from one or more of the 3 root defilements. So the 10 unwholesome deeds, so the 3 of body, 4 of speech, and 3 of mind. So the 3 of body, let's see, killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. The 4 of speech, harsh speech, divisive speech, false speech, and useless speech. So again, those arise, the first 3 arise from, well, let's see, again, either hatred or delusion. And then the 3 of mind, so the mind of ill will, the mind of cruelty, what's the other one? Mind of harming? Mind of harming. Those all arise from aversion. Yeah, all of them are based in greed, hatred, and delusion. But actually, most of them, if you pay attention, most of them are coming from aversion primarily. So actually, that seems to underlie the majority of them.
Is there a place where there's a framework of the 10 unwholesome deeds? I don't know that I've...
It comes up in a handful of suttas. I'd have to look up the references to find them, but it's in a few places. Yeah. Okay. Rick asks, can you share some reflections on skillful means with our perception of time?
Okay, continues. I frequently find myself either just trying to get through a challenging time or leaning towards the future, driven by a need to accomplish goals. What does that mean? I find myself just trying to get through a challenging time.
Like waiting for a difficult time to end, maybe?
Oh, okay. Or leaning towards the future, which is basically the same kind of thing, driven by a need to accomplish goals. Yeah. Well, that's basically the sort of one of the biggest challenges. Actually, one of my favorite quotes of Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi is that we don't practice despite the obstacles, but the obstacles are the path. How very true is that? Actually, I'm living exactly in sort of that predicament right now because my mom is visiting. And as much as I love my mom, she's not a Buddhist. And she's someone who, well, she's on the elderly side, but she's actually quite an active elderly. So she wants to do something at every single moment. Needs a lot of sensory inputs. So quite the opposite of a Buddhist monk who likes solitude and peacefulness and silence. So the first days I was, it was like quite easy. Well, not easy, but quite, doable. And then after a while, it was like, wow, this is like today. I'm like, wow, I'm so fatigued. It's very difficult, right? So at a certain point, I was like, oh, when is it going to end? Or as you said, getting through a challenging, just trying to get through, right? A challenging time because it's challenging. So that's a great opportunity. My mom right now is the Bodhisattva who has come and gone, hey, you have to actually work on that, getting back to the present moment. So essentially, that's also, the beautiful quotes that we see from Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh when he gives us the instructions on walking meditation, no coming nor going. We're always, thinking that we're coming from somewhere and going somewhere. And that's basically how we can conduct our life, right? And like there's always a sort of destination. And whenever we're experiencing dukkha, we're always looking for dukkha to end through, to find the solution through the senses. So to end the experience that we're having, so to have some kind of comfort, maybe for my mom, it can be like actually sensory input. And for me, it can be like just silence, that's also a sensory input. So essentially we're trying to reprogram the mind of finding a different escape, which is not, once again, sensual pleasures, but actually it's renouncing altogether, letting go, the joy of missing out. And it's difficult. So most of us, Ajahn Chah was saying, most of our practice is understanding what we need to do and not being capable of doing it. So we have to just be gentle with ourselves in these days and kind of observe how the mind works, observe where our triggers are, observe how, sometimes we're really clueless on how to deal with certain situations that perhaps, we were doing quite all right up until the moment when the challenging situation happens. But that means that, we're not fully enlightened. Maybe we can be just fully enlightened with that conditional, not fully enlightened. We can be enlightened in a very conditional way. If only all of those things are, that in place, then we can actually act very wisely, very maturely, very much with a mind of loving kindness. But then as soon as those conditions change, then we're a big bundle of kilesas. So it's actually a great opportunity to see what still needs to be done and how can we reach that unconditional happiness, that unconditional peace of mind, that unconditional enlightenment. So yeah, reflecting on that and saying, once again, learning from our periods of distress.
Great. And Arturo says, I was reflecting on sati today, and I came to understand it as the factor that helps develop the path at every waking moment. Is this correct? What do you
think? So, sati has a double meaning in that, yes, it means like mindfulness, being aware of the moment, but it also means recollection. And you actually, one of the problems, especially if you haven't trained it, is that you have to remember to be mindful, right? It's not something that you are kind of born with. It's something that you have to train. It's something that you have to build up in the mind so that you, whenever you're in a situation, then yes, you are, understanding that situation, understanding how to act skillfully in that situation, and you're developing the path, right? Right mindfulness is an extremely important aspect of the path, right? This allows us to be able to see things that we don't normally see. This is why in the 7 factors of awakening, sati is number 1. We have to have the mindfulness and the ability to be clearly comprehending. That's why sati and sampajanya go together, mindfulness and clear comprehension. We have to have that ability to develop the skill to always be mindful. And when we are mindful, when we are able to see clearly in a situation, then we see all kinds of opportunities and various things that we didn't see before, or that other people around us can't see. And so that allows us to have a choice, have more ability to act skillfully. So this is a very, very important aspect of the path. It's something that one should develop the mindset that there is not a single, as long as you're awake, there is not a single experience that you cannot practice sati, that you cannot develop sati, right? Sati patthana is the places, 4 specific places that we are bases for the development of our sati, right? And so you want to continue, think in your mind that sati is always available to develop it. There's not a time that you can't practice. There's not a time that you can't try to build up, to bring up your sati, to be able to clearly understand what is happening in that situation.
Great. And Guy asks, could you please elaborate on this from the Dhammapada? All conditioned things are impermanent. All conditioned things are unsatisfactory. All things are not self. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This is the path to purification. Yes, and in fact, I could recite it in Pali easily enough. So, Sabbe Sankara Anicca, Yada Panyaya Pasati, Atanibin Dati Dukke, Esamago Suddhya. Then the same for Sabbe Sankara Dukkha and Sabbe Dhamma Anatta. Yeah, it's a really beautiful set of 3 verses. It's actually one of the, I'm saying this all the time, it's one of my favorite things in the suttas, but I say that about almost every quote from the suttas. Anyway, so the Buddha here is saying that when one clearly sees the 3 characteristics, so that all things are anicca, dukkha, anatta, then one naturally turns away from dukkha. One naturally drops dukkha. This is actually what I was talking about this morning with the Adityaparayaya Sutta. When you clearly see that everything is on fire, then you naturally drop it. Like if you realize you just picked up a burning hot coal, then you drop it immediately. You don't have to think, maybe I should put down this blazing hot coal. No, you just drop it immediately. You don't even have to think about it. In the same way, when you clearly see that all things are impermanent, unsatisfying, and impersonal, then you drop them immediately. It's an automatic movement of mind. So naturally, it's the path to purification because you're dropping all of your defilements and delusions.
Excellent. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Okay. And Jen says, the Lord Buddha made a distinction between skillful and unskillful, but how did he ground his moral facts? Also, do you know how to approach the is-ought dilemma from a Buddhist perspective?
I don't understand. How did he ground? Since I've been speaking so much Italian with my mom, I don't understand English anymore. How did he ground his moral facts?
I think they mean, like, what did he base his judgment of morality on? Like, what foundation did he have for saying what's wholesome and what's unwholesome?
It's basically, thank you, Bantim. ESL course. Well, essentially, it's what is conducive to suffering and what is conducive to the cessation of suffering. It's as simple as that. As the Buddha always says, all he has ever taught is this is suffering, this is the cause of suffering, this is the end of suffering, and this is the way out of suffering. So anything that is skillful and unskillful is essentially skillful leads towards the cessation of suffering, and unskillful increases suffering. So there's not like a blank statement in terms of like, oh, this is moral and this is immoral based on, the personal view of like the person, but rather it's dependent origination. If you put these conditions in place, then you get this result. And if you get these other conditions in place, then you get this other result. It's just as simple as that. So if we want suffering, then yeah, let's do everything that is akusala. If we don't want suffering, then we do kusala. Very, very simple. So yeah, I think that would be my answer to.
And the second part of the question, how do you approach the is-ought dilemma? Do you have any idea what that means?
Yeah, this is Jen is coming from a philosophical perspective. The is-ought dilemma I know is Nietzsche. I know a little bit. It's like the very basic, and I can't tell you in deep, but it's like something that is or things are as opposed to how they ought to be. It's a kind of is ought.
I think I addressed that it's not once again like something that is.
I know enough about like Western philosophy to kind of understand where the questions are coming from, but I don't know it deeply enough to answer.
Yeah, I think based upon that brief statement that Buddhism is all about the is. The Buddha is just describing how the way things are. So there's no ought. It just depends on where you want to go. If you want to go to suffering, well, then do things that produce suffering. If you want to go to happiness, then do things that produce happiness. There is no ought. It just depends on where you're trying to go. If you want to go for a swim in the ocean, well, then go to the ocean. If you want to go for a swim in the sewer, well, then go to the sewer. I don't know why you would want to go swim in the sewer, but if you do go there, you'll find lots of people already swimming in the sewer. So I would say that Buddhism is on the is side. Now the Buddha is just describing how different choices lead to different destinations. And it's up to us to decide whether we want the destination of happiness or the destination of suffering.
Yeah, essentially there is no commandments in Buddhism. It's more like this is what you get when you put these conditions in place, essentially. All right.
Okay. And Daos asks, speaking of the third khandha, Sannya, how are you supposed to approach it? To me, it seems extremely useful to have some degree of control over perceptions, for they heavily influence feelings that arise. Well, first off is recognizing the Sannya process. So recognizing that the raw sensory data itself is different from the ideas and concepts that we overlay on the sensory experience. And also that the process of Sannya is heavily influenced by cultural conditioning. So two people from two different cultures can have the same sensory experience, but identify it in different ways. Even two people from the same culture can identify it in different ways. So Sannya is impermanent and it's conditional. And it's not the actual experience. So recognizing the Sannya process as an overlay, an addition to our actual experience. That's the main thing I think I would say. Do you have anything you want to add on this topic?
No.
No, I think that's good. And there's Jojo over there.
Jojo.
Okay.
Let's see. This one?
Yeah.
Okay. It says, I'm really focusing on my morality because Bhikkhu Bodhi and Ajahn Brahmali recommended it in talks. That's good. The Buddha also recommended morality quite a lot. So that's why the followers of the Buddha recommend morality. It's because the Buddha did. Without volition, I don't know what that phrase is doing here. How long before I get some of that sukha and bliss out in my meditation sessions and in my day-to-day life? One of you want to talk about this?
Once you let go of the craving of wanting that to happen, it's as simple as that.
Yeah.
Because it's the cause of suffering is craving. So the more you want, but when is the sukha happening? When is the sukha happening? You're basically like beating up that sukha. Like every time you say, want, I want, I want, I want. But instead, the moment you let it go, happiness ensues.
Okay. And Jay Kala says, what advice do you have for helping family and non-Buddhists understand ordination? I find people easily feel threatened when others have a conflicting lifestyle. Maybe we could each say a little bit about this. Do you want to start?
No, well, I was going to actually say it'd be good to you because Jay Kala has talked to me about over at ordination many times. So he's heard pretty much everything from me. So whatever.
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is don't try to make them understand ordination because you're absolutely wasting your time. Just live the Buddha's teachings and your family and friends will start to recognize over the course of several years, they will start to recognize the benefits and values of ordination. But your arguments and logic will never work. They might. In 1% of cases, it might work. But at 99% of the time, you're not going to win them over through arguments and logic. It's just through you demonstrating in your own life the blessings that come from ordination. And your family will see, oh, this person is calmer, they're happier, they're kinder, they're more patient. Maybe this whole Buddhist monk thing is not too bad after all. But you can't convince people of these things. If they're not interested in being convinced, then you will never be able to convince them. So it took my mom several years. Actually, it was about 3 years before she really came to accept that this was my chosen lifestyle and that it was a good thing to do with my life. It took her about 3 years. To be patient with your family. It usually takes them a while to really understand what we're doing. And they never really get it, to be perfectly honest, but they can accept that it's a good thing. Do you have any thoughts?
I mean, I'm basically living that right now. As I would say, my mom is visiting and she's not a Buddhist and was never really too much of a Catholic either. So definitely ordination is not something that she quite understands. But she's understanding it better. Essentially, my advice would be, in order to help your family and non-Buddhists understand ordination, is to practice the Dhamma. It's as simple as that. The more you practice the Dhamma, the more your mind changes, the more you become a better person, and the happier you are. And they will maybe still not understand ordination, but they will go like, there's something to this. And then definitely when they start coming to the monastery, I have to say that this has been the one biggest thing that has really shifted, in my parents' sort of outlook of what I'm doing is actually coming to the monastery and meeting fellow Buddhist practitioners and seeing how lovely the people that go to monasteries are. They're really, really nice. It's such a blessing to go to a Buddhist monastery. Even the grumpiest person at the monastery is like basically one of the nicest outside of the monastery. Do you see what I mean? So then one starts thinking, there's something to this. So there's an experience of the Dhamma. There's an experience of the blessings of the Buddhist teachings, and there's an understanding that there is something to it. And today, my mom bowed by herself. You know, it was quite interesting. It took me longer to bow than it took my mom. It took me 1 year. It took my mom 5 days. Like, it's pretty remarkable, isn't it? So yeah.
One thing I do want to add, though, is when it comes to especially parents for ordination, I think it's very important, in addition to like what I and Bhante were saying, is like living the practice and showing people about it. But I think it's good not to burn bridges. You know, one of the rules that I think is actually very important, I know it's kind of viewed as flippantly these days, but in a lot of places. But I think it's actually a very important, good thing that you're supposed to have your parents' permission to ordain. I really do. Because I mean, at the time of the Buddha, it was, already, it was kind of like a gesture, right? Because, Buddha's stealing all the sons and then daughters. It's like, at least like they have to give permission. I think that's like, I think that's a good gesture for Western or non-Buddhist parents too. It's because it's like, well, they're actually taking how you view things into consideration, right? And I know, again, people was like, oh, don't worry about it. You don't need your parents' permission. I mean, if it comes down to maybe you have to do a Ratapala or something like that, it gets tougher. but I think like most parents, if like Bhante says, if it's over a long period of time, and if you're in a Western monastery where it takes a couple of years before you're fully ordained, and then they come visit. Like, I think most parents will over time, at the very least, give the permission. And I think that's a good thing for the growth of Buddhism in the West, and for that to kind of, that connection to be made. I think it's a very good thing. So I always encourage not kind of burning bridges or being adversarial with family.
Great. And Life's a Trip says, when trying to understand the five aggregates, I get confused with the English translations of feelings and perceptions. I get confused. The word feelings seems to describe how perceptions are defined, and vice versa. I just spoke pretty extensively on this topic.
The question is here.
Oh. Do you have better translations to English of these two aggregates? Thank you. For Vedana, I mean, you could say sensations, but and that's okay. It's still not quite right. I fully agree that feeling is not a good translation for Vedana. The most literal translation would probably, actually comes from the root vid, which means to know. But then you have a million Pali words which all fundamentally mean to know. So if you just translate everything as knowing, then that doesn't help either. So I'm feeling it's not the best. Sensation is maybe slightly better. But it's important just to know what the word means. So Vedana means pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So whenever you have any kind of sensation, you experience it as one of these three: pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. That's what Vedana means. It means whether you experience something as pleasant, painful, or neutral. Whereas Sannya, as I mentioned earlier, I think identification or recognition is a much better translation than perception. But I'm actually okay with perception. I think it's not too bad. Again, it's the process by which we identify and label experiences. So to me, that's a very different thing than just the automatic like, or ugh. Like, that's Vedana. Vedana is like, nice, or gross, or that's Vedana. Sannya is like, oh, that's an apple, or oh, that's sewage, or oh, that's a carpet. So very different things. Okay, anything else?
No,
Good.
pretty.
And Guy asks, Does arrogance toward non-practitioners arise from greed, hatred, and delusion? I have little patience for ordinary people. I know they are suffering due to ignorance, but lack patience. Do I need to cultivate more patience?
You need to cultivate more compassion and more metta. And also patience, but I would say definitely more compassion. And once again, yeah, understanding that we're not much different. It's just that we kind of have a map, I would say, right? So until we're fully awakened, we still have lots of greed, hatred, and delusion. And we're still suffering. I mean, no different than everyone else. We're trembling together. So what I really like is the literal meaning of anukampa, which is trembling together. So that is a full, real understanding of compassion, is that our suffering is not different than other people's suffering, and other people's suffering is not different than ours. And even when we are practitioners, it's just that we're a little bit more aware of what's going on, and we're becoming more and more familiar. And then at a certain point, we'll be able to toss it. But until we'll be able to toss all the suffering and be over it, there is that process where we are basically no different than everybody else and just aware of that, which is actually incredible wisdom. But there's nothing to be arrogant about. There's everything to be compassionate about, because we realize how much suffering there is in our experience as human beings, and how we are all subject to old age, sickness, and death. And there's nothing to feel, like, oh, like I'm so much better than others. No, we're all, it's this distress, this existential distress. And if we're practicing correctly, then we just care for others more and more. We have more compassion for others, and we can help others. And others are helping ourselves too, and kind of showing us our blind spots. As we were saying, with Rick, I think, before. Yeah, there are certain situations where all our defilements, come in full bloom, where it's a great opportunity to see that, to look at that, and how we're no different than even people who are not practicing, the Dhamma. But we know the path. So we have the fourth noble truth. So we can, commit ourselves to get out of suffering and practice in accordance with the Dhamma.
Great. And Rick asks, can you share how best to understand Samvega? In practical ways, how can we live Samvega in our daily practice? What do you think?
Samvega is an interesting term, because it's one of those things where I don't know that I have a lot of personal experience with Samvega in a way. Like, I think more about Nibbida and Viraga. Samvega is something that's a bit more unclear to me. Yeah, it's so I think I still have to, and I don't know.
I think it's actually very much related to Nibbida. So, and actually Nibbida is the word the Buddha most commonly uses. Samvega is much less common, but its meaning is almost identical with Nibbida, in my opinion. Yeah.
So associate Samvega with the sense of urgency, no?
That's how it's sometimes translated, but Samvega is like when you recognize the danger of samsara and you have this deep sense of urgency. It's, my preceptor also explained it as, it's almost like a feeling of sadness, but not in the sense of depression, rather in a sense that samsara is a sad, pathetic place. So it's more, one has a deep sense that samsara is an utter depressing waste of time, which then can naturally produce a sense of urgency to get out of this mess.
Yeah, to me, it's very much connected to what we were saying earlier about compassion. So when you start understanding how this suffering is, human quality, something that marks that dukkha is the experience. It's the same experience of everyone, whether we're monastics, lay people, if we're Italian Americans, or if we're women, male, transgender, whatever it is. Like, it's just the experience, and it's not even a human experience. It's just a sentient being experience. There is the cat here, Stan the cat, who is experiencing a lot of dukkha right now, and he's like so human, and I'm using that word just because he's very relatable. Like, you can see all the different emotions that we have in relation to suffering, no different than that. And that creates a sense of urgency, because one becomes less passionate about the things in samsara, right? One stops, at least intellectually, wanting to search for the answers in sensual pleasures, in accumulation, in like getting that kind of hit, basically. It's basically like when an addict understands that, like, whatever the substance of their addiction, it's just not satisfying. So even though they have the urge maybe to go towards it's basically when an addict decides to go to rehab, I would say that's basically samvega. You're like, you get the sense of urgency. You're like, I need to get out of here. This is not working. This is affecting me, and everyone else around me is an addict too. And we're all doing the same thing. And so there's this like profound realization where we then have a sense of urgency, and we're like, wow, also actually is connected very much to the topic that we were talking about yesterday of karma and rebirth. I had some really serious samvega when I started understanding the implications of karma and rebirth, because subconsciously, actually, I was not really afraid of death. I was always like kind of going, like, whenever I was experiencing a lot of dukkha before Buddhism in my YOLO days, I was like, oh, I can't wait to like just get out, like end this life. But then once I started realizing that you don't live only once, and you have to come back and do this all over again. And I was like, oh my Buddha, all the high school years, they were dreadful. Oh my Buddha, all of those, all the things that you're like, you think that you've only done once and that you don't have to do it all over again, but you have to do it for countless eons. Oh my dear, oh my Buddha, get me out of here right now. So that really triggers samvega.
Sadhu. May we never have to do high school again.
Yeah. Maybe we should do a little like a sticker. Let's end it now.
The truth of high school, the origin of high school, the cessation of high school. Okay, so Shihan says, what did the Buddha say about love and its function in awakening? Well, I'm going to just define the word love in a way which is relevant to Buddhism, which has nothing whatsoever to do with sexuality. So love is one way of talking about metta. So metta karuna. So the genuine wish for everyone to be happy and free of suffering. And that comes without any conditions or requirements. So even if people are mean, well, you still want them to be happy and free of suffering. Even if people are demented, well, you want them to be happy and free of suffering. Even if people are not the way you want them to be, well, you still want them to be happy and free of suffering. And that also includes yourself. So actually, the foundation of Buddhist practice is compassion. Because if you want to get out of suffering, then that means you have compassion for at least one person, namely yourself. And in the course of cultivating compassion, compassion is all about relinquishing self-centeredness. And that's exactly what Buddhism is all about. So what ultimately triggers full awakening is when one finally relinquishes asmimana. Asmimana is the concept of self-existence, belief in self-existence. So ultimately, Buddhism is all about letting go of self-centeredness, and compassion is about cultivating a wish for all beings to be free of suffering without any distinction between self and other. Therefore, practicing compassion is also about letting go of self-centeredness. So this is why we say that wisdom and compassion are inseparable. So this is, in my opinion, this is how we can relate the concept of love to awakening. Yeah. Okay.
Great.
And Kauser Friend says, we know that brain damage can have a profound impact on one's personality, the way one perceives the world, and the actions one takes. So from that, it would seem that these are functions of the brain. But in the karma panel yesterday, Bhante Sudaso, you misspelled my name a little bit, brought up that mind is separate from the body. So the mind is not the brain or a function of the brain. What more is there to it?
I can talk about that.
Go for it.
So just to go back here, because this is real where the meat is. The way the brain damage has a profound impact on one's personality, the way one perceives the world, and the actions one takes. So what's okay? So the way I look at it is this: the mind is using the body, kind of like you get in a car and move and drive around, right? The personality, we have this view that maybe, or this wish that like the personality is us, and then in my next life, this life, I'm a male human and I have this personality, but I'm going to have that same personality in the next life when I'm a female kangaroo or something like that. Right? Personality is not this, there's no essence of personality. It's conditioned. Right? So all of these things don't negate, like what Bhante Siddhasa was saying about this. All of these things are conditioned things that arise due to being in this lifetime and having various causes and conditions related to genetics and culture and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when someone is brain damaged, that's like your car's breaking down, right? So the mind is using, you can think of it as the mind using the various sense organs to contact with the world. When those sense organs are broken down, the mind can't, interact with those sense organs, and that's just the way it is. So yeah, but you can have brain damage. That doesn't negate the fact that the mind is something separate from the brain.
Yeah. And Pintu Chakma says, how can I learn? I don't understand English. Well, I have good news. The vast majority of Buddhists in the world are actually speaking a language other than English. So depending upon what your native language is, odds are there are lots of people who speak that language and teach Buddhism. So based upon your name, possibly Hindi, maybe?
I'm not sure.
Anyway, there's basically whatever your language is, there's somebody somewhere in the world that teaches Buddhism in that language. If your language happens to be Thai, Sinhala, Burmese, Chinese, then you have lots of choices. If it's other languages, you have a few choices, but still there's a few.
If you're in Asia, many, many choices.
Yeah. Let's see. And Janaki says, how about emotional disturbances for feelings? I mean, I assume you mean Vedana. No, sorry. No, I do not know.
Sensations. How about sensations?
Sensations is okay. Yeah.
I prefer sensation to feeling, because feeling has that emotional connotation.
Yeah, that confused me. When I first read about the 5 khandhas, I saw feeling and I immediately thought emotions.
Yeah.
And a teacher had to explain to me that it didn't mean emotion.
Yeah. Getting back to actually Anagarika Sarana's question, this is, for example, another reason why to learn Pali, because then you can understand that Vedana has nothing to do with feelings in terms of emotions, or whatever is our first association with the translated word, but rather we get the raw information and we start questioning it, kind of like how Janaki is doing. Like, oh, could it be translated as emotional disturbances? Could it be feelings? Or I can go like, oh, maybe sensations, etc., etc. And this process of investigation is a really good process to actually understand the Dhamma.
this is where Vedana gets a little complicated, because I would not translate Vedana as emotions, but I think what we consider to understand as emotions are a very complicated, multifaceted thing. So like part of Vedana, you look at Satipatthana, there is Vedana that is not related to the body, right? So if you have depression or whatever, there's a Vedana aspect of that. But you can't say that the depression in and of itself is Vedana. It gets complicated when you start to use the word emotion. Because I think emotions are very, very multifaceted, complicated things that are not just connected to one aspect.
And so Guy says, I'm 68 years old and getting retirement. Could I become a practitioner and live at the Sangha, or am I too old? It depends on the monastery. So some monasteries have an age limit and some don't. That said, many monasteries don't accept people who are your age, but there are some that do. So explore your options. Especially in Asia, there are lots of places where they don't care how old you are. They're just delighted that you want to come and practice with them. There are places. There are. And David says, I was a monk in Thailand in the lineage of Ajahn Lee and Ajahn Mahabua, and I don't understand the way the new generation of Western monks are doing things. Can you explain? Facebook? YouTube?
I would like to add also the old generation of Eastern monks are doing things. So the pandemic actually got everybody to be online. And then everybody kind of stayed online. The pandemic is still happening, but even though things have shifted a little bit, and there's more in person, I think it's a great thing. Personally, it's just how history comes, probably like when printing, for example, printing of books became something more popular back in the day. Probably the monastics at that time were like, oh, I used to be a monastic. I don't know what like these new generations are doing, printing all these books. So yeah, the instrument is just the instrument. One can, print all sorts of crazy things and print Dhamma books, and one can do all crazy things with social media or with YouTube, etc., or share the Dhamma. I think it's quite wholesome. There's many people, in fact, right now engaging in right speech. So that's quite lovely, and I think the more the better.
And Robert says, I live with my mother because of my lifelong health issues. I am infinitely grateful to her for so many reasons. What can I do to most effectively offer her Dhamma without being pushy, intrusive?
Yeah, well, what I would say is, just like the question we were talking to Jay Kala, don't try to offer her anything. Like, show her, we do have a duty to try to set our parents up in a very in morality, right? That's one of the duties a child has to a parent. And if your mother is a pretty moral person, right, then whether they're Christian or whatever, if they're a moral, good person, then that's good. Like, you don't need to try to do anything to them. I think the most important thing to do is to show your gratitude, and to show that you are grateful and take care of your mother, and be kind to her, and these kind of things, right? To be very good to the people who help us, and and then if she has questions, then you can talk to her about things. But your Dhamma, the thing that you would offer, that's the Dhamma, is being respectful and being grateful and helping her out as much as you can, and as much as she helps you out.
Yeah. Okay. And Robert further says, once my mother passes, I'd love to do an extended stay at a monastery and possibly take short-term ordination. How best to prepare for doing something like this? Well, read the suttas cover to cover, all of them, and practice the Noble Eightfold Path. Do some meditation every day. These are the really important things. Yeah. Everything else you need to know, you'll learn at the monastery. And next question. Shihan says, what does the 108 beads of the Buddha's necklace represent?
I'm not the best person to answer these questions.
So I have actually come across many different possible explanations. So I think the actual truth of it is lost in history as to exactly when and why people started using 108 beads. Because the number 108 appears all over the Buddhist world and nobody seems to know exactly where it came from, but everybody has their theories.
I've also heard that the 108 is actually an auspicious number outside of Buddhism too. It's kind of like one of those ancient things, like a number. Yeah.
And we have one vote for Vedana, translated as sensations.
Yes.
From Yudi.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's slightly better than feeling.
I don't know what Janaki was referring to. And
these occur in the mind, don't they? And technically everything occurs in the mind, but I don't know what specifically this is referring to. And Isira has a question, but I don't quite understand. Is the mental state you get when you practice Vidarshana?
maybe Vipassana.
Vipassana, probably. Through a great Samadi is the foundation of feeling of Nibbana. It is a very blissful and so much relaxed, extinguished feeling when compared to the pleasure of deep meditation.
I don't understand.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Isira, if you can rephrase your question, maybe say it in a different way, then we'll try to answer. And Cindy has a question. What is the best Asian country for women to practice?
I guess since I have a female body, the question is for me. But I can't answer it because I haven't been to every single Asian country. So I'm not sure.
And the only thing I know off the top of my head is that according to women's rights groups, Taiwan has the best women's rights of any country in Asia, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best country for women to practice. Otherwise, yeah, I don't know either.
I would say the best country in Asia for women to practice is the flavor of Buddhism that you appreciate the most. So that's all it's important. So it's basically both for men, for women, for women, for men, for transgender people. Just focus on the Dhamma rather than on the body. And just see what is the flavor that, kind of gets you most interested in the Dhamma. So if it's first of all, if it's Theravada or Mahayana or Vajrayana, and then from there, if it's Theravada, then are you more, inclined towards Burmese Buddhism or towards Thai Buddhism or towards Sri Lankan Buddhism and so forth. And from there, then that will be your best country.
Okay, and Kanchana Kim says, good morning, Venerables. I am nun from Cambodia. From the picture, it looks like a Mei-chi, perhaps?
Yeah.
Could you explain to me the difference of classification of chittas through their doors? I don't know what this is referring to. If you can use the Pali terms, that might be more helpful, but I don't know. Do you know?
No, but maybe it's Abhidhamma.
It looks like an Abhidhamma question, but without more details, and again, preferably some Pali terms. I think we can't really answer this. So Janaki has a Vinaya question. I have heard about a monk who has been refused higher ordination because he wears a false leg below the knee. He has a great knowledge of Dhamma, but it is very unfortunate that Patujana monks making such unrealistic rules. Careful. You don't know who's a Patujana and who's not. Careful. Buddhism is democracy. Well, first off, no, Buddhism is not democracy. But there is, in fact, a I'll get to that in a moment. There is, in fact, a Vinaya rule which says that if a person comes to the Sangha seeking ordination and they have any of a series of serious physical health problems, and one of them is, in fact, a missing leg. That's one of the things which the Buddha said, if a person comes, they should not be given ordination. But if they are given ordination, they still are a monk. But it's a minor infraction of the Vinaya for the monks who perform the ordination. So this means that in very strict Vinaya monasteries, they will not ordain somebody who has any kind of significant health problems. And that definitely includes a missing leg. In monasteries which are not so strict about Vinaya, they may still give ordination to such a person. But they also may not, because it's actually a fairly well known in the Buddhist monastic world that these rules exist. So I know of monasteries where they will ordain pretty much anyone who walks through the door, regardless of whether or not they have a leg. But definitely in strict Vinaya monasteries, they won't, because there is, in fact, a Vinaya rule about this.
One I'd like to add. One of the things, especially I kind of see this among Westerners, at least in modern times, the whole thing that the Buddhism is democracy thing reminded me of this. Like there's this kind of view that people have a right to ordain. Right? There's a statement that I used to remember, like when I took my driver's test, right, when we were back in the day, and it says driving is a privilege, not a right. Right? And that's how I look at monasticism. Like monasticism is a privilege, not a right. Like even when I went to the monastery, I didn't know if I was going to be able to be a monk. Like, you know, Bhante could say, no, I'm not going to ordain you. Right. It's this is something that should be understood, that there are, you know, monastics are supported by laity. And if there are a lot of conditions and a lot of issues that harm that relationship or are too much of a burden on laity, then this can be a reason not to ordain. This is where like a lot of monasteries, if you're older and you have all kinds of medications and all kinds of things like that, and you're gonna all like cost a lot, like an abbot might say, like, you know, I don't know if we have the supporters to be able to take on somebody like this. Right. So this is an important thing to understand, that and even it might not seem fair. It might say, well, they were born this way, they can't become a monastic. You know, they have leprosy or whatever. You know, it might not seem fair, but this is how things are, because it's thinking about the long-term growth and support of the Sangha. Right? It's about the community as a whole, not just an individual person.
It's also about external perceptions of the Sangha, and it's also about why people enter the Sangha in the first place. So actually, in the Vinaya, there are stories of people who they saw that the Buddhist monks had access to good doctors and good medicine. So they wanted to become monks just so that they could get free medical treatment from the best doctors. Not out of any interest in practicing Buddhism, just because they wanted free treatment from the top doctors. And actually, there's a story in the Vinaya that so many people with serious health problems joined the Sangha that the doctors who were looking after the monks became swamped with their duties, to the point where they couldn't actually make a living anymore. They were trying to keep up their commitment to taking care of the monks, and they didn't have time to actually do their duties as a doctor for lay people. So, and then people think like, oh, they see all these monks and they're like, well, these people aren't actually interested in Buddhism. They're just becoming monks for the free medicine. And then people have a low opinion of the Sangha as well. So again, as I said earlier, you will still find some monasteries where people with problems like that can get ordained. But it's something that it's a real moment of pause for the monk who's giving ordination. It's like, wait a minute, the Buddha said this isn't a good idea. So I need to think really hard about this before I go ahead with this. And as for the second part of your question, you say, How can the physical body or anything related to the physical status affect a person to achieve liberation, become a practitioner, or receive any status in the Sangha? It doesn't. So even if you're missing a leg, you can still attain full enlightenment. However, you may not be permitted to receive full ordination. So I actually know of a monk in Sri Lanka, it might even be the same one you're thinking of, who's missing a leg. And he has novice ordination, and he's probably going to remain as a novice for his entire life. But if he practices the Dhamma well, then that's okay. Of course, if full ordination was offered to him, I think that would be nice. But if it's not, I understand why it's not being offered. And I don't fault, either way, I wouldn't fault the monks. Whether they decide to ordain him or not, I wouldn't fault them either way, because I understand both decisions. And it has nothing to do with one's ability to attain awakening. Okay.
Yeah, once again, I just want to add that it's very true. Everything that you're saying, Nirvana is obtained by the mind, not by the body. And the physical aspects were required only for beauty queen or king context and for the military personnel. I didn't know that, actually. Oh yeah, well, physical aspects, not just beauty. Yeah, these are all very, very, very valid points. But I think that the Venerables, once again, were stressing out the fact that also the Buddha, essentially invited us to be, as monastics, to be the heirs of his Dhamma, not of his material wealth. And so if I think this precept, in fact, it's not like a parajika, or it's not like a absolutely no, you cannot ordain. It's a minor precept, that it's not like in the highest of the precepts. So that's why there are cases where actually people are admitted in the Sangha. But if there wasn't that precept, probably then there would be many people who would get into the Sangha for the wrong reasons. So it's not a question of discrimination, but rather a question of really making sure that you don't have situations where people are taking up monastic life as a form of livelihood, which actually, since the time of the Buddha, has been the case. There are many people, not only in Buddhism, in any single, essentially, religious order that is well supported. There can be people who pick this as a form of livelihood, and sometimes reasonably so. Like, you can totally understand it, when there's especially like government like issues. There can be many people who are experiencing a lot of dire financial circumstances. Forget about the physical issues, but like in dire circumstances, and they will join the Sangha just to have food in their plate. And that is completely understandable, but at the same time, that's not the purpose why the Buddha created the Sangha. So one needs to be very careful, because then if you have people who are not interested in this form as a means for liberation, but just as a means to get material support, then the Dhamma also gets diluted and not passed on, because nobody's really working on their minds. This being said, of course, not everybody who has a physical disability has that type of intent. It's very important to highlight how this precept is not meant to be there as a kind of like trying to create an ableist order, but rather taking into consideration that for most of human history, medical care was very, very difficult to obtain. And actually, even today, in a lot of parts of the world, it's not actually as readily available as it is, say, in Europe. Like, I was very lucky to be born in Italy, where there was free healthcare, for example. Moving to the US, a lot of times I'm like disconcerted. Like, I'm like, wow, how incredible. So many things that I was taking for granted aren't there. And there are some parts of the world that even like what is available in the US is not available at all. So obviously that's, one of the biggest needs that humans have. So if you just let it open, then it can be a little bit complicated.
And Shehan asks, are Buddhist monks permitted to exercise?
Of course.
Yes, in fact, it's recommended. If your body is not healthy, then that can be an obstacle to your practice. So it's recommended to try to keep your body relatively healthy.
The Buddhist monastic life, especially in the ancient days, was exercise. Wandering around, going up and down hills, going into the, which is another reason why somebody who's like missing a leg or something, that would be quite a hard life for somebody like that. Yeah. So, I mean, most people, life was just exercise. So yes, no, exercise is part of keeping the body healthy. So yes.
And Isira asks, is it possible to get the Nibbana feeling even a tiny bit in our life with Vipassana meditation? Yes, absolutely. Actually, every time you let go of a little bit of craving, you get a tiny, tiny taste of Nibbana. So yes, you can. Yep. The Buddha defined Nibbana in many ways, but one of the ways he defined it is the cessation of greed, hatred, and delusion. So when you drop your greed, hatred, and delusion, you get a little tiny taste of what Nibbana can be like. Just a little drop of the ocean, but you get a little sense of it. Jen gives one explanation for the number 108. 6 sense doors times past, present, future times pure, impure times pleasant, unpleasant, neutral equals 108. Mm-hmm. Maybe. Practice 7 p.m. says, how can one improve their Samadhi power? Well, there's two things. There's what you're doing during meditation, and there's what you're doing when you're not meditating. So it's important to live a very peaceful, serene life, characterized by sense restraint and renunciation. And during your meditation, it's important to use a method of practice which allows the body and mind to be completely still and alert. Those are the main ways to improve your Samadhi power. For most people, the problem is actually their lifestyle more than their meditation practice. But you need both. You need to do a lot of meditation in a way that supports stillness of body-mind. And you also need to live a lifestyle which supports a quiet, peaceful, restrained mind. Anonymous asks, what is the age cutoff at your monastery?
Well, we don't really have an age cutoff. We have mostly a cutoff of everything, unless there are... Usually whenever someone comes here and is interested in ordination, we just see if it's if the conditions are right. It's not if the person is right for monastic life, but rather if this place is a good match. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily age or different things like that. Like it's not, we don't do it on an application. It's not like a job, like we don't see the resume, etc. But rather, Empty Cloud Monastery has a lot of different particular conditions that make it a suitable place for training only for particular cases. So if those conditions come into being, then absolutely. So we have now Anagarika Jens, who has been training for some time, and he's going to take Samanita ordination somewhat soon, if all goes well, if he doesn't change his mind and starts running away from the monastery. If for someone the place is not suitable, then we usually recommend another one that we know that we think that is suitable, right?
And Isira asks, is it called jhanas if there's a small white light that appears in one's mind when one is practicing deep meditation? No, that's called a small white light appearing in your mind. That's what that's called. It doesn't necessarily have anything whatsoever to do with jhana. In fact, sometimes it's just a hallucination. So if a small white light appears in your mind, ignore it and continue to focus on your meditation object. Don't get obsessed with the lights that appear or don't appear. Unless you're following a teacher who teaches Kasina meditation and they give you instructions otherwise. But with any style of meditation other than Kasina meditation, don't pay any attention whatsoever to the light. Just keep doing your meditation. right? And your concentration will get deeper automatically. Does first jhana only come after that nimitta, light? No. Again, the light is totally unimportant. It's just a hallucination. Just keep doing your meditation practice. Sud says, I have seen Christians say some prayers and psalms which seem to calm their minds in times of difficulty. Since it is having a beneficial effect, although it won't lead to nibbana, could it be considered wholesome? Do you think devas are protecting them in such instances? What do you think?
I would say yes and yes. So actually, while we were in Italy, we were having a lot of beautiful exchanges with the Christian monastics. So yes, I would say that anything that stills your mind and makes you more peaceful, etc., is definitely wholesome. Absolutely. And what was the other question? And are the devas protecting them in such instances? I believe so. I have to say that going around in Italy, definitely, warms my heart. I'm very much a scientific materialist. So usually devas are not the first beings that I think of, like when I wake up in the morning, and definitely I have very little sort of kind of experience. There are other monastics that have, like my Samadi preceptor, she has a really strong connection with devas. Bhante Sudaso loves like recollecting devas. I don't, but when I'm in Italy and certain places, it's just amazing the power that you enter certain places. And yeah, I'm like, I would turn around and I would tell Bhante, like, can you feel the devas here? And he would say yes. And so yeah, I would say I would believe so.
But as a former Catholic, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of guardian angel.
Yeah, but
are guardian angels really... not devas?
Right.
There's a lot of similarities there.
Exactly.
A lot of similarities.
All angels and all of that. But I was never.
Yeah, you were not.
Yeah, I was never a practicing Catholic, so I was always a practicing materialist.
Oh, okay, that's right. I forgot. But from a Catholic country, though.
But Buddhism actually made me more sensitive towards, that I like pay attention, I guess. So I would say that it's definitely wholesome. And, I don't understand too much other religions outside of Buddhism, but I feel like that if people are practicing in a way that is beneficial for themselves and others, then I think it's good practice. But whenever it's harming themselves or others, then I would say it's not a beneficial practice.
Yeah. And it looks like we're coming to the end of the questions and also the end of our time. So it's been a delight discussing the Dhamma with all of you. And I think we can go ahead and end the session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.
Oh, 1 second. There's an extra question.
So this says...
We have the last minute question.
During Buddhist time, even people as old as in their 80s became monastics and attained Nirvana. There's one female monastic I remember. Yeah. And again, there are some monasteries where they will ordain you no matter how old you are. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, once again, it really depends on the different... I would say that anyone who actually really, really wants to get full ordination can do it.
Yeah.
Perseverance. Like my preceptor, my Samaneri preceptor, I have to ask her several times and wait for 1 year over and over again. And then eventually she was like, okay, yes, I'll ordain you. Yeah. And she also was like, and I'll ordain you next week. And I was like, wait, that is way too soon. And it was so funny because then all of a sudden I was like, no, it's too soon. I can't do it. And then it occurred to me. She did it in that way just to make me kind of like go, do you really want this or not? Mm-hmm. Very skillful.
Yeah, that was brilliant. And Kumu says, is that practice similar to Devanusati? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And now we really are done. So we already did 3 sadhus, but you can never do too many sadhus. So let's do 3 more. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Sadhu. And we'll see you next time.